everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today it's session 20, and I just want to give everybody a heads up. I'm going to probably be recording a bunch before I edit them because I really want to try to catch up with my Discord, which we have a study group, and in that study group we're on session 26, but we've hit pause for the rest of the month until next month we'll move on to 27, so I really want to try to get through session 26 so that I'm on the same page, pun absolutely intended, with my Discord study group because it's been kind of difficult having two different read-throughs going on that are like really close together, if you can imagine, keeping the sessions kind of separate, and I think it would be much better for my own brain to be on the same session as the study group. So I'm going to work on recording, and then I'll work on editing and getting them posted, and I'm definitely going to be focusing on the recording until I get through session 26 by the end of this month. So just as a heads up, if it seems like my schedule is a little weird and wonky this month. It's also, of course, the holidays. I have a 4-year-old who will actually be 5 on December 14th, so he's pretty hype this entire month with his birthday and Christmas back to back, and so that will be also distracting me from this project, but that's my little spiel on my current thoughts and schedule going forward with the podcast. But I'm definitely excited to record and teach with all of you, so let's go ahead and jump into session 20. I am Ra. I greet you in the love and the light of the infinite creator. I communicate now. Questioner. I was thinking the best way to do the book is to continue working on the history of evolution and its mechanism until we completely make it through the third density and what will occur in the first part of fourth density, so that the mechanisms of developing the mind-body-spirit complex will be brought out. If I get stymied someplace in one of these sessions as to what questions to ask and where, not to waste time, I may ask some questions that I will use later in the book, but we'll try to always continue along those lines. First question, to go back just a little bit, is what happened to the second density entities who were on this planet who were unharvestable? I assume there were some that didn't make the harvest into the third density. Can you tell me this? I am Ra. The second density is able to repeat during third density a portion of its cycle. So, firstly, I think it's really interesting that Don has plans for this book that didn't actually turn into what he was anticipating for the book. I think he was thinking of a more structured dissemination of Ra's teachings. I'm very grateful, obviously, that they did it this way with just the actual conversation of Don and Ra. I think that's obviously the most pure way to get this information, and I'm just grateful that that's the choice that they ended up going with. So in this question then, Don is continuing his query into the second density and the second density harvest, and wants to know what happened to the second density beings that were unharvestable, and Ra says they're able to repeat a portion of their cycle during third density. So at some point, Ra says that, second density is like billions of years. First density doesn't really have a time frame because there is no time in first density, but second density is a very long period of time. It's just as long as it takes. And so our third density was kind of artificially started by Yahweh, and we will talk about this a little bit more in this session even, and there were some second density entities who were ready to join third density when that cycle was started, but obviously there are a lot. I'm looking out my window at a bunch of snow-covered trees and little birdies flying around, and so there's obviously, we still need second density. Second density is a part of our third density experience. We have to have these plants and animals and minerals and all of first density as well to make a viable third density. So these second density beings are still able to potentially make harvest at any time, because I don't think there's the same kind of clock like there is for third density. Third density is a very rigid, strict clock. First and second density don't have that same clock that happens where it's just time to weigh and separate the wheat from the chaff. That doesn't happen in second density as far as I'm aware and from my understanding of this process. At least not in the same way that it happens with third density. And I do think that is because at the end of third density, there is a process of actually doing the weighing. In the Egyptian culture, we have the weighing of the heart, this concept of sifting through all of our life experiences and finding out if we are ready to move into fourth density. For some beings, it's very obvious. You can take a look at their violet ray and say, okay, yes, you're ready to move into fourth density. But for many beings, it's, it has to be discerned where that being is ready to go. And that's just the process of harvest. And again, third density, it happens on a specific striking of the hour. So 20.2, Don says, then the second density entities that did not get harvested at the beginning of this 75,000 year period, some are still in second density on this planet. Were any of these who remained in second density harvested into third density in the past 75,000 years? I am Ra. This has been increasingly true. So, as our third density has gained more polarity and more awareness, that has also had an effect on second density, gaining more awareness and coming up upon their own harvest. In 20.3, Don asks, so more and more second density entities are making it into third density. Can you give me an example of a second density entity coming into third density, say, in the recent past? I am Ra. Perhaps the most common occurrence of second density graduation during third density cycle is the so-called pet. The animal which is exposed to the individualizing influences of the bond between animal and third density entity. This individualization causes a sharp rise in the potential of the second density entity, so that upon cessation of physical complex, the mind-body complex does not return into the undifferentiated consciousness of that species, if you will. So, in second density, again, we have more of a group consciousness, and it's the process of an entity recognizing its own individual nature that allows it to move into third density. So, having a pet, obviously, giving them a name, putting clothes on them, as some people do, these types of things, projecting a personality, clothing them in the personality and identity of being your child, as a lot of people do. These things help individualize that creature, obviously. So, pets are second density beings who have come closer and closer to that individualization process. And as we mentioned in the last session, and Rod talks about later, there are pets who have been individualized to continue to incarnate as pets because they want more experience with their beloved humans that have helped them through that individualization process. I also do feel compelled at this point to mention that pet is a wide term and but also a specific term. But I think that a lot of it is also about the domestication of the animals. So not even just pets, but even our domesticated farm animals. I think we don't think of them as often in this realm, but the word pet actually originated from what farmers would call a bottle-fed lamb, because a bottle-fed lamb becomes so sweet and attached to the humans who are hand-feeding them that they became adorable, and they were what we first called pets, were these bottle-fed lambs. So I really think that a lot of the process is when we take animals out of their natural environment, and humans are then taking care of them on a daily basis and meeting their physical needs, like feeding. And, with domesticated animals, humans are also usually choosing sexual partners for the animals. These sort of survival things, when humans intervene in that process, I think that is really when that human-animal bond begins to take place, where that personal relationship between human and animal. And sure, yeah, there are lots of farm animals that live in abject herd situations where they aren't seen as individualized animals, but they're still domesticated. They still have their needs met by humans. They aren't living in a situation where their thoughts have to go towards survival. They have the relative freedom, because of that domestication, to think in more abstract ways, which is what Ra talks about being a necessity of moving into third density. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the farm animals as well, who have been domesticated for thousands and thousands of years. I also think that this is an area where a lot of individualization and potential third density awareness can occur. But obviously, the pets that we have in our home who sleep in our bed with us, these are the ones who are going to be closest and most likely to be third density harvestable. And the best example, the most likely example. It's probably pretty hard to find pets who aren't. Pets are probably the ones that are incarnating in seniority of vibration in second density. They're getting born into bodies that will be human companion animals. And obviously, too, we can all have relationships with wild animals. I'm sure there are a lot of people here, myself included, who have had personal relationships with individualized wild animals who have built a bond with us through that trust of being fed every day by us, and even given a name, and just that personal recognition of them being an individual creature and not just a part of a flock or a herd or a pack. So I personally just feel so much love all of the time for all of our second density creatures. I think sometimes it's easy to put certain second density creatures into a specific box where we deny their potential for individualization, because that's an easier place to be in regards to how we treat them. But I do think that how we treat second density at large is an important place where we can find our own polarization, our own attitude towards these creatures and beings, be it plant or animal, is a profound thing. And I think the way we have industrialized animal usage is, let's say, a drag, one of the drags on our process of moving into fourth density, because we really just kind of see these beings as objects culturally at large. Obviously, those of us who have more of a spiritual awareness are less likely to just objectify plants and animals, but the culture at large definitely does objectify most plants and animals and sees pets as this specialer thing, right? And I think that's a distortion that I'm trying to mitigate at this point of the discussion between Dawn and Ross. So thank you for listening to my rant, and I hope that encourages you to look at all of creation on an even wider lens as being divine and having the potential to harvest into third density, and remembering that it's us who are catalyzing that process through how we choose to treat these creatures. And then I also wonder, too, if this individualization isn't, like I said, some sort of process where an entity begins, like there's an individualization that happens, and then they have some seniority of vibration where they're able to incarnate into bodies that have more opportunities for individualization to occur. I do wish that this process, Dawn had asked a few more questions about that interim space between being individualized and becoming a third density being. Like, what's the potential difference between that process? And is it as soon as they become individualized that they become third density harvestable? I don't know. I don't think so, because later on when Ra and Dawn are talking about Dawn's cats, Ra says that their cat Gandalf is third density harvestable and was in a previous lifetime, but has chosen to come back as a cat again to be with Dawn and Carla, versus their cat Fairchild, who has not reached that level of individualization yet, or has not reached harvest yet. But obviously they're probably somewhat individualized, being a house cat who is exposed to the vibrations of spiritual humans. But again, how long is that process? how can we intensify that process? I'm very curious about that, about how we can invest more in our second density brethren. So in 20.4, Dawn asks, then can you give me an example of an entity in third density that was just previously a second density entity? What type of entity do they become here? I am Ra. As a second density entity returns as third density for the beginning of this process of learning, the entity is equipped with the lowest, if you will so call these vibrational distortions, forms of third density consciousness. That is, equipped with self-consciousness. So here Ra is saying that the beginning of third density is full of very animal-like creatures. We, as a culture, draw such a rigid line between human and animal, and I think that has done us a great disservice. I think so much of the arc of third density is kind of removing ourselves from nature because we think we're above nature, but then also finding that out, discovering that we're not so far removed from nature and that we need to reintegrate with where we have come from to actually move forward and go beyond where we are. So again, I don't think that we have any second density beings incarnating who are being harvested, incarnating on Earth right now, because we're at the end of this third density cycle, and beings are incarnating with seniority of vibration, meaning that they've had enough lifetimes as third density to have a polarity bias that brings them close to harvest. That doesn't mean we're going to have a very big harvest, unfortunately, because so much effort has been exerted to keep people in a state of confusion. But early third density beings aren't going to have that kind of experience / awareness / understanding. We talked about in session 14 how it's because of the genetic interventions that Yahweh made upon the third density vehicles here on Earth that really make us look so much different from our second density form. And typically that's not the case. Typically third density beings look much closer to second density beings. So I think that's another way that Yahweh's interventions have distorted us. Because we look and seem so different from second density, that allows us this separation from our physical animal selves in an artificial way, in a way where we deny that that's a part of ourselves. Whereas, like I've said, I think the arc is that we learn to rise above it, but we have to really understand that part of ourselves and not just reject that part of ourselves. And it's my own personal theory, and maybe I've mentioned this before. I'm super sorry for those of you who have been listening through in order, kind of back to back. If I repeat myself, I'm so sorry. I talk about this stuff a lot, so it's hard to keep track of where I've said what. But I do think that, in general, what we refer to as our shadow self is a holdover of our second density instinctual self. So I think the process of integrating that shadow self is quite congruent with the process of understanding our animal self and understanding those instinctual feelings and emotions that we have that revolve around survival, and in particular, red and orange ray energies. So that's my opinion on that. Something to think about if you would like to. In 20.5, then, Dawn follows up and says, this would be a human in our form, then, who would be beginning the understandings of third density. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is correct. So yeah, again, evolving into the human form is what would happen on our planet. As Ra speaks of later, a good percentage of third density in our logos does have an ape body, does have a bipedal form. But these beings aren't actually going to become humans, most likely earthling humans. They're going to start on another cycle and have differences and probably won't have genetic intervention by a guardian that creates such a difference in their appearance. So then in 20.6, Dawn does a bit of a pivot and says, speaking of the rapid change that occurred in the physical vehicle, the change from second to third density, this, you said, occurred in approximately a generation and a half. Body hair was lost and there were structural changes. I am aware of the physics of Dewey B. Larson, who states that all is motion or vibration. Am I correct in assuming that the basic vibration which makes up the physical world as we experience it changes, thus creating a different set of parameters, shall I say, in this short period of time between density changes, allowing for the new type of vehicle? Am I correct? I am wrong. This is correct. So again, this process is a vibrational change when a planet goes through the process of the densities. When third density starts, there is a upshift in the vibration, which changes the third density vehicles to be more appropriate to third density. And then now we're going through that process now into fourth density, where the vibrations are again upshifting. And we're currently having dual activated entities who are born into dual activated bodies who have more ability to access and work with the fourth density vibrations and energies, and then helping to continue that process of upshifting until in a few generations we have fully fourth density beings on our planet. And again, that's just a process that is happening automatically, this vibrational upshift. But the free will of all of the third density thought forms that still exist on our planet are slowing this process, creating that drag on this process. Not all third densities have such a disharmonious transition into fourth density. On some planets, everybody's pretty much ready to dive into this upshift and allow the new world to be born. But we're still pretty attached to a lot of our third density structures and thought forms. And so our free will is allowing us the time to finish the unwinding process of releasing and allowing these thought forms and structures to allowing ourselves to let go of these things. And it's hard. We're so nostalgic and we seek comfort. And so we want what is known to us, and sacrificing what we know and what brings us pleasure for the unknown is difficult. That's why our harvest is going to be small. That's why those of us who are working in consciousness have a responsibility to focus a little bit more on that process of relinquishing third density thought forms and strictures and having the faith to surrender to the fourth density that is calling us and will be here regardless of what we do. But we do have the potential to slightly accelerate that process on an individual choice level so that the collective also has a slight acceleration of that process. And that's the purpose of Wanderers and dual activated entities, to help engage these vibrations so that they become more a part of our collective reality and not just our individual realities. So in 20.7 then, Dawn asks, just as a side question here, is the physics of Dewey Larson correct? I am wrong. The physics of sound vibrational complex Dewey is a correct system as far as it is able to go. There are those things which are not included in this system. However, those coming after this particular entity, using the basic concepts of vibration and the study of vibrational distortions, will begin to understand that which you know of as gravity, and those things you consider as n dimensions. These things are necessary to be included in a more universal, shall we say, physical theory. So, here Ra is co-signing Dewey Larson as being pretty accurate in his discerning of the nature of reality, the physical structure of reality via mathematical equations, essentially. I don't know a ton about Dewey Larson's and Dewey Larson's physics, but if you're interested in that and you like physics and math, it might be an interesting thing for you to look into. So in 20.8 then, Dawn asks, was this entity Dewey, then did he bring this material through in his incarnation for use primarily in fourth density? I am Ra, this is correct. So I think this is Ra essentially confirming that Dewey is a wanderer who had a mission to come and offer us these equations to allow us a greater awareness of the potentials of our physical reality. But that's just my guess based on the previous conversations where Ross says that wanderers incarnate with a mission to help the transition, and it seems like Dewey might have been one of those wanderers. So in 28.9, Don says, "Thank you. Yesterday we were speaking of the split that takes place in third density when an entity either consciously or because of bias chooses the path of service to others or service to self. The philosophical question of why such a split even exists came up. It is my impression that as it is in electricity, if we have no polarity in electricity, we have no electricity. We have no action. We have no... Therefore, I am assuming that in consciousness, without such polarity, there would be no action or experience. Is this correct?" And Ross says, "This is correct. You may use the general term work." So basically, this is, I think this is really a core part of what Ra teaches, is that you need to build up polarity so that you're able to do work. Work being a very wide term, conceptual term. But if you're just existing in the sinkhole, that means you're going back and forth and you're not really building a polarized charge on either end of the spectrum. The availability of that potential is very short. So the whole point then is to find a way to build up your own polarity, because then you have a magical charge. You're able to do more work. You're able to gain more awareness of the reality around you. And I think a lot of us know just what that awareness has given us as we've read the raw material, and it's pulled us little by little up out of the sinkhole. It gives us a purpose and a reason to make the choice. And then we see, life doesn't necessarily get easier. Our day-to-day experience doesn't necessarily get easier, but it does get more interesting. There's a lot more things going on, psychologically, mentally, spiritually, things that we can work with versus just being an unconscious person who is on autopilot throughout most of their day and not really concerning themselves with their own spiritual growth. And I think that's the draw for a lot of us, is this upshifting in our own personal vibrations that allows a different experience of reality where we have more awareness of what's going on instead of just being little animals working with our instincts and just letting ourselves be pushed to and fro based on our emotional states, regardless of where that to or fro might be. The more you gain awareness, the more you have a little bit more control over yourself and your experience of reality. It was like I was talking about before, you can exist in the I have to do this version of reality. These are my obligations. This is what I have to do to survive. Or you can start to exist in the I get to do this. I get to live this third density life, this physical life where I have all of these choices and I have these beings to care for, including my own personal vehicle. And just that, even that small frame of mind, change of frame of mind, can just give us so much more in our daily lives. It can give us the ability to wake up with an excitement about what the day contains versus, dread. And I think that's what a lot of unconscious beings do experience, is just that kind of heaviness, that dread of putting in the time to do all the things that need to be done. And then in 2010, Don says, "Then the concept of service to self or service to others is mandatory if we wish to have work, whether it be work in consciousness or work in the mechanical or Newtonian concept in the physical. Is this correct?" I am Ra. This is correct with one addendum. The coil, as you may understand this term, is wound, is potential, is ready. The thing that is missing without polarizing is the charge. So here's Ra essentially affirming what we were saying just in the last session, that polarity is mandatory. And again, I think so many people think that, if you become aware enough, then you get to sixth density awareness, and that's the point where there is no polarity. So the real big brain is to not have any polarity at all, to not worry about polarity, because in sixth density, there isn't polarity. But in third density, we actually have to engage with polarity. And it's my own personal conclusion that when polarity ceases to exist in sixth density, that's because there's only the one polarity. It's only service to others. Service to self stops existing. So there is no longer two potential poles where one can do work. One can only do work on the one pole, the path of unity, the path of compassion and acceptance. And that's why Ross says polarity ceases to exist where they are, because there aren't two poles anymore. There's only one pole, so there isn't the concept of two poles. So ultimately, obviously, I'm assuming if you're listening to this, you resonate with the service to others path, and the service to others path just goes further. That's really my understanding of what Ra teaches, is that you can go much further before you don't hit a brick wall, polarizing service to others. You don't get to sixth density awareness, whether it's in sixth density or within your third density life, and then polarity doesn't matter anymore. Your choices stop mattering. You can make whatever choice you want. That's not what it means to have no polarity. It means that you have stopped engaging with the other polarity, because that polarity is a dead end. The service to self polarity is a dead end. And it's really only for those who just truly enjoy the process of subjugating others. And I don't think most people do enjoy that. That's why our planet is moving into fourth density positive. Even if most people aren't being harvested, most people are repulsed by the idea of oppressing others for their own gain. And so here Ra is saying too that the potential for all beings is there. It exists. You don't have to build up polarity to have the potential. The polarity is the charge that then allows the work to occur. So in 2011, Don says, then the charge is provided by individualized consciousness. Is this correct? I am Ra. The charge is provided by the individualized entity using the inpourings and instreamings of energy by the choices of free will. So here Ra is just kind of articulating Don's idea a little bit more. We have all of these energies streaming into us, and we get to choose how to react to them with our free will. And that's what builds our polarity, is how we react to the energies that are coming through us and hitting us. So in 20.12, Don says, thank you. As soon as the third density started 75,000 years ago, and we have incarnate third density entities, what was the average human lifespan at that time? I am Ra. At the beginning of this particular portion of your space-time continuum, the average lifetime was approximately 900 of your years. That's a big number. That's a long lifespan. And we do have lots of, legends of those who have lived much longer lives. And obviously it's something that's possible, but we're going to go on here now and talk about that and how we have messed up that one here on Earth. In 2013, Don asks, did the average lifespan grow longer or shorter as we progress on into the third density experience? I am Ra. There is a particular use for this lifespan in this density, and given the harmonious development of the learning/teachings of this density, the lifespan of the physical complex would remain the same throughout the cycle. However, your particular planetary sphere developed vibrations by the second major cycle, which shortened the lifespan dramatically. So apparently 900 years is the average lifespan. It's chosen for a reason, but as disharmony creeps into certain social complexes, that lifespan diminishes. And so I would assume then, Ra had a very harmonious third density experience. I wonder if that means that they had lifetimes that were 900 years. And, maybe that's one of the reasons why they just didn't really know how to interact with us. And, obviously one of the reasons why they wanted to try to help us. They do say at some point that the average lifespan when they went to Egypt was like 45 years. So they saw this condition, felt a ton of sympathy and compassion for such short lifespans, but then just didn't understand how that could affect an entire culture where you don't have any beings who have the accumulated wisdom of what is essentially 15 lifetimes, where the Egyptians were. So 900 years is the appropriate lifespan for third density, but it gets shortened throughout the process of a inharmonious third density. So then in 2014, Don asks, assuming a major cycle is 25,000 years, at the end of the first 25,000 year cycle, how long was the lifespan? And Ra says, the lifespan at the end of the first cycle, which you call major, was approximately 700 of your years. Questioner, then in 25,000 years, we lost 200 years of lifespan. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner, can you tell me the reason for this shortening of the lifespan? I am Ra. The causes of this shortening are always an ineuphonious or inharmonious relational vibration between other selves. In the first cycle, this was not severe, but due to the dispersion of peoples and the growing feeling complex/distortions towards separateness from other selves. So, as our third density population felt itself being more separate from the other portions of the third density population, this is what started to shorten our lifespan in that first 25,000 years. And we're going to go on and talk about that a little bit more here as Don continues to question. So in 2017, Don says, I'm assuming at the start of one of these cycles, there could have been either a positive polarization that would generally occur over the 25,000 years or a negative polarization. Is the reason for the negative polarization and the shortening of the cycle the influx of entities from Mars who had already polarized somewhat negatively? I am Ra. This is incorrect. There was not a strong negative polarization due to this influx. The lessening of the lifespan was due primarily to the lack of the building up of positive orientation. When there is no progress, those conditions which grant progress are gradually lost. This is one of the difficulties of remaining unpolarized. The chances, shall we say, of progress become steadily less. So here Ra's talking about the law of responsibility. This happens on a larger scale, and it also happens on a personal scale, where if you aren't using your opportunities to polarize, those opportunities diminish. And so you just have less opportunities, and ultimately, if you continue to refuse to make the choice, your lifespan gets shorter and shorter. So my guess is that this is for efficiency purposes, actually, since we're just trying to cycle through so many incarnations. If this incarnation isn't granting you the proper catalyst to polarize, then this incarnation is going to be shortened so that you can start a new incarnation sooner. And hopefully that the programming that you have for that incarnation and the catalyst that you have in that incarnation will propel you to polarize. But if you aren't using this life experience to polarize, then what's the point of this life experience, according to the Logos, who has created this third density to encourage people to polarize? So, yeah, if this life experience isn't encouraging polarity, then it's going to dissipate, and you'll be given another one where hopefully that life experience will encourage you to polarize. And two, Ra saying, that Mars wasn't necessarily polarized negatively when they incarnated here, and that didn't really affect our lifespan, whatever Mars brought over, which I guess would be a logical thought of Don to have. But Ra says that if they did have any negative polarization, they were essentially given a sort of clean slate at the start of this cycle. But it was in general, as we're going to talk about here, because we have so many different entities, not just Martians. There's a lot of separateness in perceiving other tribes on planet Earth. So in 2018, Don says, the way I understand it, at the beginning of this 75,000 year cycle, then, we have a mixture of entities. Those who have graduated from second density on Earth to become third density, and then a group of entities transferred from the planet Mars to incarnate into third density here. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is correct. And then Don is into his line of questioning, and he actually in 2019 starts to ask another question, which interrupts Ra. Ra was going to continue on with this response. So 2019, Don says, continue. And Ra says, you must remember that those transferred to this sphere were in the middle of their third density, so that this third density was an adaptation rather than a beginning. So again, the Martians weren't starting their third density over necessarily, though they were starting the cycle over. They were in the middle of their third density when they came here. So 2020, Don says, thank you. What percentage of the entities roughly who were in third density here at that time were Martian, and what percentage were harvested out of Earth's second density? I am Ra. There were perhaps 1/2 of the third density population being entities from the red planet, Mars, as you call it. Perhaps 1/4 from second density of your planetary sphere. Approximately 1/4 from other sources, other planetary spheres whose entities chose this planetary sphere for their third density work. We have beings from lots of places who have come to Earth. And again, this is not a normal thing for third density. And it's one of the big driving factors for why we are the way we are. So in 2021, Don says, when they incarnated here, did they mix? Did all 3 of these types mix together in societies or groups, or were they separated by group or society? I am Ra. They remained largely unmixed. Questioner. Then did this unmixing lend to a possibility of separation of group, then, or the possibility of warlike attitude between groups? I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner. Did this then help to reduce the lifespan? I am Ra. This did reduce the lifespan, as you call it. So, all of these various tribes from other planets incarnating here in individual societies really developed their own experience and way of relating to each other and the planet. And because of this isolated nature of these different societies, when they would come in contact with each other, they seemed so different, so incongruent, so ineuphonious, as Ross says. Their vibrations did not match with each other, and this then reduced the lifespan. So in 2024, Don asks, can you tell me why 900 years is the optimum lifespan? I am Ra. The mind-body-spirit complex of third density has perhaps 100 times as intensive a program of catalytic action from which to distill distortions and learn teachings than any other of the densities. Thus, the learned teachings are most confusing to the mind-body-spirit complex, which is, shall we say, inundated by the ocean of experience. During the first, shall we say, perhaps 150 to 200 of your years as you measure time, a mind-body-spirit complex is going through the process of a spiritual childhood, the mind and the body not enough in a disciplined configuration to lend clarity to the spiritual influxes. Thus, the remaining time span is given to optimize the understandings which result from experience itself. So in theory, we're given 900 years so that we could process our lifetime of experience. And in that context of a much larger lifespan, for the first 150 to 200 years, you're considered a child. And so we're all just babies. Here in the next question, I'll go ahead and read it. 2025, Don says, then at present it would seem that our lifespan is much too short for those who are new to third density lessons. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is correct. Those entities which have, in some way, learned/taught themselves the appropriate distortions for rapid growth can now work within the confines of the shorter lifespan. However, the greater preponderance of your entities find themselves in what may be considered a perpetual childhood. So again, due to the seniority of vibration, it's sort of this feedback loop where, yes, things have become more bellicose and intense, so the lifespan is shorter, but the entities who are incarnating do have some experience as the cycles progress. So there is some understanding in their deeper nature, in their awareness of self and reality that allows them to accelerate their growth in a way that they can then usefully process their experience within the shorter time frame. But it's, again, not ideal, and most beings aren't able to grow up because there just isn't enough time. And the catalyst is so intense, and there's so many intentional distractions from that process. So just another thing to think about when you're being hard on yourself is that we have such a short window in our lifespans, and that's not really how it's supposed to be. It is how it is. It is a consequence, and it is still workable. But we are supposed to live much longer lives where we can really have the time to process all of the things that happen to us and the consequences of our choices. So in 2026, Dawn says, "Thank you. Now, back to the first 25,000-year period, or major cycle. What type of aid was given by the Confederation to the entities who were in this 25,000-year period so that they could have the opportunity to grow?" I am Ra. The Confederation members which dwell in inner planes existence within the planetary complex of vibratory densities worked with these entities. There was also the aid of one of the Confederation which worked with those of Mars in making the transition. For the most part, the participation was limited, as it was appropriate to allow the full travel of the workings of the confusion mechanism to operate, in order for the planetary entities to develop that which they wished in, shall we say, freedom within their own thinking. It is often the case that a third density planetary cycle will take place in such a way that there need be no outside, shall we say, or other self-aid in the form of information. Rather, the entities themselves are able to work themselves towards the appropriate polarizations and goals of third density learn/teachings. So here Dawn is asking, how did the Confederation help Earthlings during the first cycle, and what kind of interactions happened? And Ross says that, apparently Yahweh was there a little bit helping the Martians with their transition. There were some inner planes Earth entities there to be contacted and give and receive some communication from the incarnate beings on the surface of the planet. But usually during the first cycle, there is a distance. The Confederation keeps its distance. They don't want to prematurely influence the development of our culture, of our planetary collective mind. So they stay away. And in a lot of cases, in fact, Ross says it is often the case that third density beings don't need any sort of intervention. They're able to go through this process of third density, gradually gaining awareness via polarity to the point where they're able then to reach their harvest without any sort of outer intervention or aid. So they don't do anything usually during the first major cycle. And they're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next couple questions. So in 1027, Dawn says, "I will make this assumption then. If maximum efficiency had been achieved in this 25,000-year period, the entities would have polarized either towards service towards self or service to others, one or the other. This would then have made them harvestable at the end of that 25,000-year period to either service to self or service to others type of fourth density, in which case they would have had to move to another planet because this one would have been in third density for 50 more thousand years. Is this correct?" I am Ra. Let us untangle your assumption, which is complex and correct in part. The original desire is that entities seek and become one. If entities can do this in a moment, they may go forward in a moment, and thus, were this to occur in a major cycle, indeed, the third density planet would be vacated at the end of that cycle. It is, however, more toward the median or mean, shall we say, of third density developments throughout the one infinite universe, that there be a small harvest after the first cycle, the remainder having significantly polarized, the second cycle having a much larger harvest, the remainder being even more significantly polarized, and the third cycle culminating the process, and the harvest being completed. So essentially Ra is saying, yes, that if all of us could have gained consciousness and polarity enough to reach harvest at the end of the first 25,000 year major cycle, then we would have to go to a fourth density planet. Now, I'm reading this closely, and I'm seeing that Ross says, indeed, the third density planet would be vacated at the end of that cycle. So I'm not sure if that means that the social memory complex would have to go to another planet, or if they would then just exist in the fourth density version of that planet. My guess would be the latter, that then the third density would cease to be populated and we would just move to the fourth density, because Ross says that the planet is a part of fourth density. The consciousness of our social memory complex links with the consciousness of the planet. That's what makes a planet itself conscious, is the entities on the planetary sphere having that social memory complex level of awareness. So my guess is what Ra is saying here is that yes, the third density plane of this planet would stop being populated by third density species, by third density beings, and we would move into the fourth density of this planet. But it is possible that Ra is also saying that we would have to move to another planet, but I don't think that would be the case. That doesn't really make a ton of sense to me. I just think that if all of third density makes harvest at some point before the end of the 75,000 years, that we just start the fourth density process and the third density plane goes unused for the rest of that period of time on the galactic clock. But Ra's saying that the usual progression is that there's a small harvest at the end of the first cycle, a much larger harvest at the end of the second cycle, and then the third cycle is a very big harvest of a good portion of the planetary population. We did not follow that general rule. We are not in the median or mean range of how planets move through their third density experience, hence the variety of experiments that have occurred with the various interventions by higher density beings. Here in 2028, Don says, very good. Then was the Confederation, shall we say, watching to see and expecting to see a harvest at the end of the 25,000 year period in which a percentage would be harvestable fourth density positive and a percentage harvestable fourth density negative? I am Ra. This is correct. You may see our role in the first major cycle as that of the gardener who, knowing the season, is content to wait for the spring. When the springtime does not occur, the seeds do not sprout, then it is that the gardener must work in the garden. So, we have the garden analogy of the Confederation seeing themselves as gardeners. Therefore, the harvest then is like at the end of the season, the fruits have culminated and grown and are ready to be harvested, but they aren't trying to cultivate and harvest through the winter when things are still preparing to sprout and bloom, but when they don't see any sprouts coming, then they know that there is work that needs to be done. And that was our planet. So in 20.29, Don asks, am I to understand then there was neither a harvestable entities of positive or negative polarity at the end of that 25,000 years? I am Ra. This is correct. Those whom you call the Orion group made one attempt to offer information to those of third density during that cycle. However, the information did not fall upon the ears of any who were concerned to follow this path to polarity. Questioner: what technique did the Orion group use to give this information? I am Ra. The technique used was of two kinds. 1, the thought transfer, or what you may call telepathy. 2, the arrangement of certain stones in order to suggest strong influences of power, this being those of statues and of rock formations in your Pacific areas, as you now call them, and to an extent in your Central American regions, as you now understand them. Questioner: are you speaking in part of the stone heads of Easter Island? I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: how would such stones influence a people to take the path of service to self? I am Ra. Picture, if you will, the entities living in such a way that their mind-body-spirit complexes are at what seems to be the mercy of forces which they cannot control. Given a charged entity such as a statue or a rock formation charged with nothing but power, it is possible for the free will of those viewing this particular structure or formation to ascribe to this power over those things which cannot be controlled. This, then, has the potential for the further distortion to power over others. So, apparently, sometime during the first cycle, negative entities of Orion put the stone heads on Easter Island as a means of trying to inspire a desire of power over nature and then therefore power over others into humans. And it didn't really work, but the attempt was made. And here in 20.33, Dawn asks, how are these stone heads constructed? I am Ra. These were constructed by thought after a scanning of the deep mind, the trunk of mind tree, looking at the images most likely to cause the experience of awe in the viewer. So this is similar to what Ra did with the pyramids. I don't think we've discussed that yet, but in the future, Ra talks about how they made the Great Pyramid, at least. They made the Great Pyramid by thought. It essentially appeared overnight and in Egypt, and this was part of their plan as well. So similar mechanisms, however, it seems that the idea of what the intentions are, the charging of these structures, has an effect of its own. Also, when Ra chose the pyramid to create, they didn't scan the deep mind of our collective to see what kind of image would create the most potential for a desire for power. They chose the pyramid because they had higher density entities come to Venus and give them pyramids. So the pyramid actually has a functional shape instead of just an inspirational quality. So there is that difference as well. So 2034, Dawn asks, well, then, did Orion entities do this themselves? Did they land in physical, or did they do it from mental planes? Or did they use one of the incarnate entities to construct these by thought? I am Ra. Nearly all of these structures and formations were constructed at a distance by thought. A very few were created in later times in imitation of original constructs by entities upon your Earth plane/density. So, some of the heads on Easter Island were constructed by humans at a later time trying to recreate these, but the majority of them that exist there were created at a distance by thought by the Orion entities. And 2035, Dawn asks, what density Orion entity did the creation of these heads? I am Ra. The fourth density, the density of love or understanding, was the density of the particular entity which offered this possibility to those of your first major cycle. So it was a fourth density social memory complex. In 2036, Dawn says, you use the same nomenclature for fourth density negative as for fourth density positive. Both are called the dimension of love or understanding. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is correct. Love and understanding, whether it be of self or of self towards other self, is one. So, the lessons in fourth density positive and negative seem quite at odds, and the effects of these lessons are quite at odds, but it's still the same vibrational quality. It's just that the fourth density negative obviously takes all of that love and holds it in for the self, and all of the understanding is for the self, the individualized self. And fourth density positive is working to, of course, universalize those vibrations. So in 2037, Dawn asks, now what was the approximate date in years past of the construction of these heads? I am Ra. This approximately was 60,000 of your years in the past time-space of your continuum. Questioner, what structures were built in South America? I am Ra. In this location were fashioned some characteristic statues, some formations of what you call rock, and some formations involving rock and earth. Questioner, were the lines at Nazca included in this? I am Ra. This is correct. So the Nazca lines were created by thought, presumably again, by the Orion entities trying to instill this choice of power over others into Earthlings. And 2040, Don asks, since this can only be seen from an altitude, of what benefit was this? I am Ra. These formations were of benefit because charged with energy of power. So again, this charging of intentional power was what gave these creations their power. 2041, Don says, I'm a little confused. These lines at Nazca are hardly understandable for an entity walking on the surface. He cannot see anything but a disruption of the surface. However, if you go up to a high altitude, you can see the patterns. How is it of benefit to the entities walking on the surface? I am Ra. At the remove of the amount of time-space which is now your present, it is difficult to perceive that at the time-space 60,000 years ago, the Earth was formed in such a way as to be visibly arranged in powerful structural designs from the vantage point of distant hills. Questioner. In other words, at that time, there were hills overlooking these lines. I am Ra. This will be the final question of this session. The entire smoothness, as you see this area now, was built up in many places in hills. The time-space continuum has proceeded with wind and weather, as you would say, to erode to a great extent both the somewhat formidable structures of Earth designed at that time and the nature of the surrounding countryside. Questioner. I think I understand then. Then these lines are just the faint traces of what used to be there? I am Ra. This is correct. And I think this is a very logical conclusion. Obviously, the structures of the Earth were different at that time. And so the appearance and location of these designs were much more discernible by the beings who lived in that area. And now what we have left is just a faint shadow of what used to be. But the fact that if this is the same timeline, I mean, we're saying more than 50,000 years ago, if it happened in the first cycle, the fact that these Nazca lines were created more than 50,000 years ago, and we still see them, like the line, I'm sure some have been covered up by earth and wind blowing soil over them, but so many of them are still there. So for something like that to still exist 50,000 plus years later is very, very interesting and, is affirmative of their unnatural creation, right? So 2044, Don says, thank you. We need to know whether or not it is possible to continue with another session later today, and if there is anything we can do to make the instrument more comfortable. I am Ra. It is possible. We ask that you observe carefully the alignment of the instrument. Otherwise, you are conscientious. Is there a short query before we close? So, here Ra's saying, yes, you can have another session, but you need to observe the alignments. Don did get a little bit historical toward the end here, asking about specific dates and the mechanism of construction and these kinds of things. It was borderline off topic. And of course, lots of people love these parts of the material. I'm not saying that there's anything explicitly wrong with these questions or that they need to be discarded or anything like that. But Ra was a narrowband. Ra makes these observations at the end of the session, and so when they say stuff like this, to look deeper, as we're trying to do here, I do think Ra is commenting on this slightly skewed desire for more information. As Carla had put it, Don was a scientist, and Ra didn't want to talk about things that could be measured. And here Don is trying to get measurements of time and engineering. So, but it is just a light warning from Ra. But I do think that's what they're referring to. So, in 2045 then, Don says, I intend in the next session to focus on the development of the positively oriented entities in the first 25,000 years. I know that you can't make suggestions, but this seems to me to be I hope that I'm going in the right path in investigating the entire development and influences in the history of our third density. Can you give me any comment on this at all? I am Ra. The choices are yours according to your discernment. I am Ra. I leave you in the love and the light of the one infinite creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one Creator, Adonai. So, poor Dawn, just wanting a little bit of direction. And Ra's unable to comment any more than they already said that, carefully observe the alignments. Dawn has some grasp of what that means. Here, far removed, over 40 years into the future, having studied this material for much longer than Dawn ever had the opportunity to study it, me personally. It's easy to see what Ra's talking about and to discern what Ra meant and what kinds of questions Ra thought was okay, but Dawn's still trying to figure this out. They've only had this contact for not even a month at this time. It's February 9th, and the first one was, January 27th, or January 17th, so, yeah, January 15th, so Dawn's still learning. We have the perspective of time and that Dawn just did not have at this point, so no shade towards Dawn. He's absolutely doing his best, and I'm very grateful for what he did. So that was session 20. A pretty long one. We had 45 questions, a lot of good information about that first cycle of our experience here on Earth, and objectively the information about the Nazca lines and the stoneheads on Easter Island are pretty interesting and do make me think of, the shred of validity that the Ancient Aliens show has when talking about some of these things that were unnaturally created, but obviously you should definitely always take that show with a grain of salt. Because there is just so much about our past that we don't know and we just won't understand. And it's not really necessary to focus on and understand that stuff to move forward in your evolution. Knowing that the Nazca lines and the Easter Island heads were created 60,000 years ago, so what? Right? That doesn't actually affect the grand scheme of what we're trying to do here, what Ra wants us to try to do here. So, anyway, as always, thank you all so very much. I have through session 26 to hopefully bang out by the end of the month, and I will be editing and uploading along the way. I'll just really focus on this project and get done what I can, and I'm very grateful for everybody who is listening and learning along with me and diving into this study with me, and I'm, of course, as always, grateful to our one infinite Creator in all its glory, giving us this beautiful experience of life. Because if you can get to a point where you can see the beauty, it's there. And it's not an ignorance of the hard and harsh things that are happening in our third density, but it's just in a recognition and appreciation for all the work that has gone into creating this experience for us. And we get to choose every day how we feel about it. And for me today, right now, I'm very grateful. So thank you all, and I will see you next time with session 21.